Okay, so this video is meant to answer the question, what is a primary source versus a secondary source, and where do I find primary sources and secondary sources? In history, we don't have a lot of really specialized vocabulary, but what we do have is primary sources versus secondary sources. So you really do need to know this basic vocabulary before you can go on and do your own research for the course. The basic definition of the primary source is that it's a first-hand account or record created during the period under investigation. And this is what the key point is. Created during the period under investigation. Created at the moment of the thing that you're studying or around the moment of the thing that you're studying. Primary sources can be written. They can be visual in terms of images or photographs. They can be oral in terms of music or sound recordings. They can be objects. We also refer to objects as material culture. They can be buildings, they can be environmental sources, things of that nature. Sometimes there's a discussion about whether memory or testimony, particularly memory or testimony taken several decades after an event happened, if that's a primary source. We tend to look at memoirs, testimony as primary sources. Again, things as if the memory is the thing that is created during the event or during the period under investigation. This is just a list of all kinds of primary sources I could think of. Just know that there is a wide variety of what could be a primary source. Anything basically that is created in a specific time period, we can find a way to use as a primary source. The kinds of information that we can get out of these primary sources, that we can interpret from these primary sources, is going to change, obviously, with the type of primary source it is. But that doesn't mean we can't use it. So anything, written sources like letters, diaries, autobiographies. I want to point out that fiction, novels, short stories, poems, plays, all of that is fair game for insight, for information about the time period that it was written. Newspapers, magazines, we're used to official memoranda, i.e. things written by politicians or government officials, things that we would tend to find in sort of official archives. But think of anything, photographs, song lyrics, again, primary sources of when they were created. And I would encourage you to be creative about what you can use as a primary source. A website that is created in the year 2005 is a primary source for 2005. Just to give you an example of what a primary source is, I went to one particular website called oldbaileyonline.org. This is where they have court records from a particular court in London, Central Criminal Court, called the Old Bailey, that was functional 1674 to 1913, and they have court transcripts of all these different court cases available online. So I just went to this website, I threw in the word tattoo, and a bunch of different court cases popped up where tattoo was part of the court testimony, and this is just merely one of them that happened in 1894. An example of a primary source. Another example, this one more, I was looking for a visual source or a photograph to show you, again, available online. I went to the Library of Congress website. They have a number of online images, threw in the word tattoo, and this is what came out. So visual sources, oral sources in terms of what you can hear, what you can see, film, documentaries, all sorts of things, as long as they are sources of the moment when they were produced or the time period when they were produced. That makes them primary sources. In contrast to primary sources, secondary sources analyze, interpret, or comment upon primary sources to create historical narratives about the past. So they use primary sources to inform them about what happened. Typical secondary sources are academic articles, academic monographs, academic edited collections, and some academic blogs and websites. And the key to sort of figuring out what is a secondary source is, first of all, does it have footnotes? And do those footnotes go to primary sources? This is why we have footnotes, why we use a lot of citations in our writing, historians do. because in sort of the perfect world, a reader can go read a secondary source and see what primary sources this secondary interpretation is built upon. So they could go and look up these primary sources and see if they agree with how the historian has interpreted the primary source, right? Secondary sources are based upon the interpretation of primary sources. So some typical secondary sources. Excuse me, I went to the library website where I looked at JSTOR. JSTOR is a particular database for academic articles. So I found the Journal of British Studies, where they have a number of historical academic articles, and I found this by me. If you went through the footnotes, you would see a number of primary sources involved here. Here I found an academic monograph or an academic book, Gender in the Negotiation of Daily Life in Mexico, 1750 to 1856, by Sonia Lipset Rivera. Professor Lipset Rivera will be talking to us in a subsequent unit in the course, and this is one of her monographs. Okay, so just to sort of solidify the difference between the primary source, here's a list of examples of primary sources and secondary sources. In some ways, I think fairly intuitive. Typical primary source are personal letters, so Queen Victoria's personal letters, written first-hand accounts of what she's thinking at a given moment. And then the secondary source would be what we assume would be the interpretation of her personal letters to be made into a biography, right? A biography of Queen Victoria would then be the secondary source. The video game Donkey Kong, created at a certain time, played at a certain time. That's a primary source of that time. And then the article in the Journal of Cold War Studies about video games interpreting Donkey Kong as part of a phenomenon of a particular time period is the secondary source. This example about newspaper articles is a little bit more complex because many people would automatically think that a newspaper article is a primary source, but here is a way to make it a little bit more complicated. A newspaper article in the Globe and Mail about the start of World War I, written in 1914, is a primary source because World War I started in 1914, so it's created at the time of the event. If we're studying 1914, that's going to be a primary source for us. A newspaper article about how the Globe and Mail covered the start of World War I, written in 2014, is interpretive, right? It's interpreting the primary source article that happened in 1914. So it's a secondary source. Now here's where it gets complicated. If we were writing a research paper about how people thought about World War I in the year 2014, we could use a Globe and Mail article about World War I written in 2014. It would become then a primary source of 2014. It is not a primary source of 1914. Okay, so where do I find sources for my research essay? Now, I sort of facetiously put a picture of the library there. Yes, the library is sort of the first and best place to start. Note, there is not a picture of Google there. There's a picture of the library. I would always recommend physically going, taking your body to the library and going there because there's all sorts of things you can find just by going to the shelf. That if you've identified one book to look at, if you go to the shelf, probably other books will jump out at you that could be useful for your project. So I will always say take yourself physically to the library, but do not worry, there are other online things you can do. Go to the library website. On the front page of the website, there's all sorts of different headings here. Look to subject guides. Click on subject guides, and it'll take you to this list of different disciplines. Now, this is a history class, so we're going to click on history, but this doesn't preclude you from investigating what's under all these other ones. Art history would probably be great for issues about the body, Canadian studies, all sorts of different film studies, all sorts of different subheadings will help you get to information. I say to go to history right now because it'll always take you into historical information. Click on history, you get a bunch of other different subjects. Because I work on the British Empire, I'm always looking at different ones. It all just depends on what kind of project you're looking at. I'm going to advocate clicking on the history of sexuality because a lot of things to do with the history of the body are found in the history of sexuality for some reason, whether or not they're really about sexual things or not. They tend to be sort of captured in the history of sexuality. So you click on history of sexuality, and that will bring you to this page. Note that sort of at the start of this page are all sorts of dictionaries and encyclopedias. Those are not secondary sources. Those are tertiary sources, right? They're collections of bibliographies of collections of information from secondary sources. So they're sort of even more removed from the primary source. But they're a good ground zero or starting point for finding your way into a topic. But look at all these different headings that happen to help you identify other secondary sources, to help you identify archival and primary sources. And all of those different headings exist for all of these different headings. So there's quite a number of different avenues you can go down to find primary and secondary sources. If all of this is just far too overwhelming, what I would say to do, first of all, contact me, contact your instructor, particularly if you have a very specific idea of what you want to research, where you want to find things. Contact your TAs. If that doesn't work, we also have a dedicated historical librarian at the library. Her name is Margaret McLeod. She's lovely. Her contact information is here. You can find her email address if you go to this website. You can make an appointment with her. Chances are she'll lead you through these subject headings and sort of the process that I've just led you through. But again, if you have a specific idea of what you want to do, I think she could really help you out in terms of where you're finding things. Just before I let you go, I want to give a few cautionary notes about what secondary sources to use and about finding secondary sources. Not all secondary sources are created equal. I'll just say it out loud. I don't want to see you using in your proposals or in your final essays as secondary sources survey textbooks, Wikipedia, or museum websites and other educational websites that are designed for the general public, that are designed, probably pitched towards high school or even lower, sometimes I've seen before. Why do I not want to see these things as secondary sources in your handed-in work? Well, number one, survey textbooks. What are they? Survey textbooks are the textbooks that you are basically made to buy for first-year survey history courses. So that's The Making of Europe, The Making of Canada. These are giant honking textbooks. I believe for The Making of Europe, we used the West, and sort of they start at the beginning of time and they go to the present. Oftentimes, they are not necessarily engaged with primary sources anymore, right? They are tertiary sources. They're a collection of a bunch of secondary sources. They're usually written by a bunch of different authors. And they're not engaged with interpreting primary sources anymore. Wikipedia, the amount of time I could spend talking about the ins and outs of Wikipedia, stay away from it as a source. This doesn't mean don't go read survey textbooks for information. Don't go read Wikipedia for information about your topic. Absolutely go to these places, find basic information out, find the names of people who are involved, find keywords for you to look up elsewhere. Just don't use these sources in the stuff that you're handing in. Don't use these sources in your proposal bibliographies. Don't use these sources in your research essay bibliographies, especially for your final papers. Why? Because part of what we're testing with these papers, with these handed-in assignments, is your ability to do research. And this is particularly salient when we're talking about museum websites and things of that nature. Your ability to do research has to go beyond the first, 10 hits that come up in Google. Okay, so museum websites, First of all, not necessarily secondary sources, often not engaged with primary research and primary interpretations, often just tertiary interpretations. Again, the same for other educational websites. This is not the best available secondary academic information you can find, right? Those are going to be academic articles, those are going to be academic monographs, they're going to be academic edited collections. That's the best possible information you can find about your topic, okay? And I want to see your ability to find the best possible information out there, both in terms of primary sources and in terms of secondary sources. So this is not putting your best foot forward when you identify this stuff. Again, feel free to use these sites when you're finding out things about your topic. Just don't cite them. Don't make that be the thing that you're resting your own interpretations on, the thing that you're resting your own knowledge on. This is merely just your way into the topic, okay? You're going to have to identify better sources, the best available sources indeed, for your projects. If you have any questions about what a primary source is, what a secondary source is, if you have a source that is sort of somewhere in between primary and secondary, would love to chat about it. Get in contact with me or your TA or indeed Margaret McLeod, and we can help you out. Good luck.